Today in our 2019 Newmar Bay Star Motorhome, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Roadmaster rear anti-sway bar. Having a motorhome can be a really nice thing. We can travel around the country, seeing a lot of places we haven't seen, or go camping, or whatever we want to. But one thing that people don't talk a lot about when they talk about motorhomes is how uncomfortable the drive can be. Because let's face it, we have a lot of area for wind to catch and to start pushing us around. So whether we're going down the highway and we have a crosswind that pushes us, or if we're at the campsite and we just start hitting some uneven pavement, it can get a little unnerving. So before we put any of our suspension components on, let's take our motorhome for a test drive and see how it handles. Now, as I'm driving through our course, when I went over the bump course, there was a lot of swaying going on. As soon as I went over one speed bump, it really wanted to rock back and forth. And now as I come up to the slalom course, you can really feel that swaying going on. It doesn't want to react quite as quickly as it should. And in the event of a wind or a crosswind or anything like that, we're gonna have to fight that steering wheel, position ourselves in the seat, and have that that fight the entire time we're driving. So by the time we get there, we're gonna be exhausted. And with the parts installed, we're going to take our motorhome back out on the test course and see how it handles. And as I start to go over the speed bumps, obviously they're still there, so we still have a little bit of a bounce, but it's a lot more controlled, and I'm not sliding around in my seat and really having to react too much. It's just more of a normal speed bump. So it's definitely helping out a lot. I can relax while I'm driving and not have to worry so much about fighting the steering wheel or reacting to that sway. As I continue to go through the slalom course, I can really feel just how much support is there. I don't have as much body roll going in and out of the turns, and it just feels like the motorhome wants to go faster whether I'm coming in or coming out of those turns. So here's what our Roadmaster Anti-Sway Bar looks like once we have it installed. Now this is going to do for side-to-side movement what a good pair of shocks does for up and down. It's going to support the weight of our motorhome and keep it nice and planted, so we're not having that weight transfer and causing us to have a lot of body roll, fighting the steering wheel, and overall just feeling a little uneasy when we're driving down the road. And it's going to do that because our sway bar is going to mount directly to the axle as well as the frame and have a nice sturdy position so it can handle all that weight transfer and reduce the amount of body roll we have, so we can have a nice comfortable ride and enjoy our motorhome. Now you might notice that we have the factory sway bar in front of the rear axle. That's because our Roadmaster sway bar is not meant to replace it. It's just there to help support all that weight and give us extra stability in the rear end. Our bar is going to be 1 5/8 inches thick, and it's going to be made out of chrome moly steel. So it's going to be extra strong and durable and make sure that it can handle all that weight transfer. Our sway bar is going to come with new bushings. These are going to be polyurethane instead of rubber, which means they're going to resist most automotive chemicals and UV rays, and they're going to last us a long time. And the fact that our bushings are going to be lubricated means that it's going to provide just enough pivot that the bar isn't going to be so stiff that it causes a problem, but also not flexible enough that we're not getting the support. Our kit's going to come with everything we need to get it installed. The bar, all the hardware, as well as all the brackets. Installing it is going to be pretty straightforward. We're not going to have to drill or cut anything. However, we are going to have to remove the U-bolt nuts on the bottom of our axle, and these are torqued down pretty high. So you might want to pick up an impact wrench as well as a torque wrench that's going to go high enough to torque these back down. Now that we've seen what our bar looks like, gone over some of the features, let's put it on together. To begin our installation, I do want to mention that we just lifted the rear end of our motorhome using the leveling jacks just enough to let the suspension hang down a little bit. Then we're going to come to the rear axle and move into the rear wheel well. If we look directly inside behind our tires, we'll have 4 bolts going into the frame there. We're going to need to remove the 2 lower ones, and you'll notice that the leaf spring is just right below it. Now that's only because we have the suspension flexed a little bit and it is raised up. If it was fully on the ground and all the weight's in the way, that back bolt would be nearly impossible to pull out because the leaf spring would be in the way. I'm going to use a 21mm socket to remove the bolts. Now it may help if you have a long extension, so you don't have to be right next to it to reach the heads. Now you'll notice whenever I pulled that bolt out, there was a nut that dropped down. And that's because the nut on the back is actually a little keeper nut, so we don't have to hold a wrench on the back to take the bolts out, but we'll take out the other one as well. We're going to grab one of our frame brackets here. It's going to be an L shape, and we'll have two tabs that are coming off the bottom. Now the two round holes in that flat section is going to go directly against the frame, and then we'll reuse the factory hardware to put it back in place. So I'm just going to take my bolts, I'm going to pass them through the bracket, that way I don't have to worry about it falling down. And then the nuts on the back have this little tab, so when it starts spinning it'll catch and we don't have to hold it. So I'll put this in the back and get it started by hand, and then we can tighten everything up. And we'll come back with that 21mm socket and tighten up the hardware. Now that we have that frame bracket on, we're going to repeat the same process for the other side. And we're going to move underneath our motorhome and come to the rear axle. Now on each side we'll have this plate with our U-bolts attaching the axle to the leaf springs. We're going to need to remove the 4 nuts holding it in place, but if you do have your motorhome lifted, you want to support the axle, because as soon as we take these off, there's nothing holding the axle to the motorhome anymore. So you want to have a jack stand, make sure it's supported, or if your tires are on the ground, you'll be okay. Now these are very, very tight, so we went ahead and soaked them down with some penetrating oil. It's a good idea to do that, let it soak for a little bit. But you're going to want to grab a 1 1/8 inch socket, and we're going to start loosening up all those U-bolts. When you remove the nuts and the washers, you want to make sure you hold on to them. And although it may not seem like it, this plate is pretty heavy for how big it is. So you want to be mindful once you take out the last couple of bolts so we don't have it fall on top of us. In fact, I'm going to put one just hand tight, a couple threads in there so I don't have to worry about the plate falling. So we can let our plate kind of rest down. We don't need to fully remove it, so you just want to make sure that it doesn't fall off. So you can leave one nut on, however you need to, but you just don't want that to fall on top of you. Now we grab the flat plate out of our kit. We'll have 2 oblong holes, and then several other holes with this triangle section here. That tapered section needs to go towards the back, and then the 4 small holes need to go towards the inside. So if we lift it up, we can see that all the holes are going to line up with our U-bolts. So what I'm going to do is I'll kind of slide it into position. I'm going to take the nut off that was holding it in place, line up my holes, lift my bracket up, and just to make sure I don't drop anything, I'm just going to loosely install one of the nuts just to hold everything in place until I can replace all the factory hardware. Then we'll come back with that 1 1/8 socket, and we're going to tighten up all the nuts. When you're tightening these down, you want to alternate going back and forth from side to side. That way you get an even clamping force and the U-bolt doesn't bind up. With this side done, we're going to go ahead and repeat that entire process on the other side. You just want to keep in mind when you do take these nuts out, we are going to have to torque them back down, and it does go to a pretty high torque value. We're going to grab one of the end links out of our kit and also the tub of grease that comes with it. I'm just going to take a little bit. I do suggest wearing gloves because this can get a little messy. I'm just going to spread a little bit of that grease onto the end of the bushing here on both sides. That's going to reduce the amount of squeaking that's caused when we're driving down the road from moisture getting in between the bushing and the bracket. Just make sure you have a thin layer going around the bushing. We'll lift up the end link, and it's going to go in between the bracket that we put on the frame there. We'll grab one of the long bolts from our kit and go through coming from the outside going towards the center, and then we'll secure it with a nylon lock nut. Now right now, I'm just going to leave this on there hand tight so it'll hold the bracket, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to grab our sway bar now, and again on the end of the bar we're going to have these bushings. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease on each end as well. You don't need a whole lot, just a thin layer on each side of that bushing. And we'll take another one of our long bolts. We're going to lift our sway bar up into the end length, and just like with the other bolt, we're going to come from the outside going in, and that'll hold our sway bar up on one side so we can get the bolt in on the other side. Now our sway bar is going to hold itself in place, but you want to be careful because it can still move quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and put a lock nut on each one of these bolts. Again, just hand tight so I don't have to worry about it falling down. And get ready to put in our bushings. Now these are split bushings, so we can just slide them over our bar. But before we put them in place, we're going to put some lubricant on there. And with these, you don't need a lot, but you want a decent amount. You just want to coat the entire inside of the bushing. Then I like to put a little bit in that channel here on the outside. And again, that's just going to cut down on that squeaking and any kind of noise like that when we're driving down the road. Once we have it greased up, we'll slide our bushing over, and we can grab the saddle clamp, and that's going to fit right into that channel right over the bushing. And we're going to put it really close to the end of the bar right at this curve. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Now if we come back to the plate where those 4 holes are, you'll notice that each one of these are just slightly offset from each other. We're going to be working with the very rearward hole, move forward, skip one, and then work with the next one in line. I'm going to grab the shorter, smaller bolts out of our kit. We'll follow it up with a flat washer, and we're going to drop it down through the plate in those 2 locations. Now we're going to repeat that on the other side as well. Now we're going to rotate our sway bar up. It may help if you have an extra set of hands, but we're going to rotate it up until we can line up the saddle bracket with the bolts that are coming down. Once everything's lined up and the bolts are going through, we're going to put a flat washer and a lock nut on the bottoms to hold everything in place. If you can get one started, it'll hold the bar up. We can rotate it the rest of the way and get the rest of the hardware in place. Now if you notice, our bracket does still move quite a bit. We want to push that bracket as far back so that we can make sure that our bar here is going to clear our shock. Even if we have it forward, it still clears, but we want as much room as we can. So I'm going to push it forward, make sure it's not going to move on me. And then I'll put a 16mm wrench to hold the bolt on top. And then I'll tighten up the nut on the bottom with an 18mm socket. We come back and tighten up the rest of the hardware. And for the rest of our bolts down here, the larger one on the bottom, as well as the larger one up top, I'm going to use a 15/16 socket and wrench. And I'm going to tighten them up just enough to where that nut makes contact, but it doesn't crush the bushing. And we'll repeat that for all the remaining bolts we have. With our sway bar loosely in place, I'm going to come back with a torque wrench. I'm going to torque all my hardware down to the specified amount in the instructions. And when you're tightening down your U-bolts, you want to do a couple turns on one and then move to the other side so it clamps down evenly. That'll finish up your look at the Roadmaster rear anti-sway bar on our 2019 Newmar Bay Star Motorhome.